So imagine going to the grocery store today, right? You're just, doing your normal weekly run, grabbing the staples.
Yeah, just a totally standard Tuesday afternoon errand.
Exactly. You toss a bottle of ketchup in your cart for a barbecue you're hosting this weekend, and then you swing by the pharmacy aisle.
Because you need something for the baby.
Right. You pick up some medicine for your baby who's been, like, incredibly fussy and just won't sleep at all.
We've all been there.
You go home, you use the ketchup, you give the baby the medicine.
Yeah.
Now, I want you to imagine a reality where that ketchup you just bought is secretly laced with formaldehyde.
Literally embalming fluid.
Yes, embalming fluid, just to hide the fact that it was made from rotting, decomposed tomatoes.
Which is just, incredibly visceral to think about.
And that medicine,
Yeah.
that, beautiful little bottle of soothing syrup you just gave your infant, it is packed full of unregulated, highly addictive opium.
It honestly sounds like the premise of a dystopian horror movie. Or like some post-apocalyptic survival scenario where all the rules of society have completely collapsed.
It totally does. But the thing is, we take for granted that the food in our pantries won't kill us.
Oh, absolutely. We operate under a massive baseline of implicit trust today.
Yeah. But the safety we enjoy today, it isn't a default state of nature. It had to be, like, clawed out of an era of unfettered corporate greed.
Fought for tooth and nail.
Exactly. By a rogue government chemist, a few incredibly brave journalists, and a massive, deafening public panic.
Which is what makes the source material for today so fascinating.
It really is. So today we are taking a deep dive into the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. We're looking at the sources to see how America finally escaped the nightmare of the Gilded Age grocery store.
And setting the philosophical stage for this deep dive is crucial because, like you said, when you or I buy food or medicine, we just assume a baseline of non-lethality.
We assume someone somewhere is checking this stuff.
Right. But the material we are diving into today reveals so starkly that this safety was dragged out of a heavily industrialized, rapidly changing society.
A society where, frankly, the pursuit of profit had entirely outpaced any concept of consumer protection or transparency.
Completely.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because to really understand the massive public outrage that forced the government to act, we first have to understand the environment that made that outrage necessary in the first place.
You have to look at the mechanics of society at that specific time.
Yeah. Like, why did the American food and drug supply become so uniquely dangerous during the late 1800s?
Well, the root cause fundamentally comes down to logistics.
Logistics.
Yeah, driven by rapid urbanization and industrialization. In the late 1800s, the United States was undergoing this unprecedented demographic shift.
Right, millions of people moving around.
Exactly. People were leaving rural agrarian lifestyles and just pouring into these rapidly expanding cities.
So you have a growing nation increasingly dependent on industrial production.
Fueled heavily by immigrant labor moving into dense urban centers, yeah.
So the entire physical footprint of the country is changing.
Radically changing.
People are moving away from the source of their food. I mean, before this shift, if you wanted a tomato, you grew it in your yard, or you bought it from the farmer a mile down the road.
Right. The visual and geographical connection to your food was immediate.
The distance between the farm and your dinner table was negligible. You could literally look at the food, smell it, and know exactly how fresh it was.
But then that connection was severed. Suddenly you have millions of people in dense cities like New York or Chicago who, they cannot grow their own sustenance.
They're living in tenements. There's no space for a garden.
Exactly. The food has to be brought to them from across the country. The supply chains stretch from a few miles to hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles.
And here is the fatal technological gap in that era, right? They are moving food across a continent, but they do not have modern refrigeration.
That's the core of the issue. The logistics simply weren't built for that kind of distance without a way to control temperature.
Which is just a recipe for disaster.
It really is. That technological gap created a massive economic dilemma for food producers. They had to ship perishable goods, meat, dairy, produce across the country on trains.
But the food was literally rotting in transit before it could ever reach a consumer's plate.
Right. And if a producer loses half their shipment to rot, they lose their profit margin.
You go bankrupt.
Exactly. So they needed a way to halt the biological process of decay, or, well, at the very least, a way to keep the food appearing fresh upon arrival.
And that economic pressure leads directly to the solution, which the industry called adulteration.
Adulteration.
Which is really just a polite clinical word for tampering with the food supply to cheat the consumer.
Adulteration became the standard operating procedure. Food producers turned to using dangerous chemical preservatives to stabilize their products.
And the most notable one, the one that truly highlights the desperation and the sheer danger of this era, is formaldehyde.
Formaldehyde, yeah.
Let's linger on that for a second because I want the gravity of this to truly land with you, the listener.
It's hard to even wrap your head around.
It is. Formaldehyde is embalming fluid. It is used in mortuaries to preserve corpses.
Right.
Imagine ordering food delivery on your phone today, but the restaurant is 3 weeks away. So to make sure the meal doesn't look like a moldy science experiment, when the driver finally hands it to you, the chef just casually embalms your dinner.
It's absolutely mind-boggling.
How does formaldehyde even work in food? Like biologically speaking?
Well, biologically speaking, formaldehyde is a cross-linking agent. It binds proteins together, essentially freezing the cellular structure in place.
Okay.
And that stops bacteria from breaking down the tissue, which stops the visual and olfactory signs of rot.
So it looks and smells fine. But consider what happens when a human being actually ingests that.
Right, because your stomach relies on acid and enzymes to break down proteins for digestion.
So when you introduce food that has been chemically armored by formaldehyde,
Your digestive system cannot process it properly. It leads to severe gastrointestinal distress, toxicity, and cellular damage.
you are weaponizing the food against the human digestive tract just to make a tomato look redder.
That's exactly what they were doing.
But surely people noticed they were getting sick. Like, were consumers just totally in the dark about this chemical tampering?
Actually, the public consciousness was beginning to grasp the reality long before the federal government took action.
Oh, really?
Yeah, society knew conceptually what the problem was. A vital piece of evidence from the source material is an article published in Scientific American magazine.
I love the timeline on this detail. That article was published in 1882.
1882, yes.
That is a full 24 years before the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 was passed. A nearly quarter-century warning that the food supply was poisoned.
It's almost 3 decades of staring at a burning building before anyone decided to establish a fire department.
Wow, that's a great way to put it.
The article was titled New Laws for Analyzing Food and Drugs. And what's fascinating here is that it laid out highly specific draft definitions for what constituted adulteration.
Right. It proves that the scientific community, and by extension the informed public, had already categorized the exact methods producers were using to commit food fraud.
Exactly. They knew exactly how the cheating was happening.
Let's look closely at those 1882 draft definitions because they read like a criminal playbook for food manufacturers.
They really do.
The first definition of adulteration for food and drink is, and I'm quoting here, if any substance has been mixed with it so as to reduce or lower or injuriously affect its quality or strength.
Right, so this is the economic dilution tactic.
Watering down milk is the classic example, right?
That's the most common one, yeah. But it went much further. Adding gypsum or chalk to flour to increase the weight and volume.
Chalk and flour.
Yes. You are diluting the nutritional value of a staple food just to stretch the product and squeeze a few extra fractions of a penny out of every pound sold.
That is wild. And the second definition really builds on that economic fraud. It says, if any inferior or cheaper substance or substances have been substituted wholly or in part for the article.
Substitution is insidious because it completely bypasses the consumer's ability to gauge value.
What's a good example of that?
It means substituting roasted chicory root for actual coffee beans. Or using cheap rendered animal fats, often from diseased animals, instead of churning real butter, and then selling it at the premium butter price. You are paying for a specific good and receiving a fundamentally inferior, sometimes dangerous counterfeit.
Then there's the third definition, which gets right to the heart of the formaldehyde issue.
Right.
It says, if it be colored or coated or polished or powdered, whereby damage is concealed, or it is made to appear better than it really is, or of greater value.
This is the illusion of freshness, and it is perhaps the most dangerous tactic.
Because we rely on our senses.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Human beings have evolved biological danger signals. Smell, color, texture. We use those to know if food is safe to eat.
If meat is turning gray, our disgust response tells us to avoid it.
But producers were using chemical dyes, heavy metals, and preservatives like formaldehyde to make rotting meat look vibrant red again.
They were using chemistry to override human evolutionary survival instincts. masking the biological decay.
Which perfectly sets up the most grotesque definition of all from that 1882 draft.
Oh yeah, this one is rough. Adulteration is when food consists wholly or in part of a diseased or decomposed or putrid or rotten animal or vegetable substance, or in the case of milk, if it is the produce of a diseased animal.
It sounds incredibly graphic, but this had to be explicitly defined in legal terms because producers were quite literally sweeping up the floors of the slaughterhouses.
Just sweeping the floor.
Taking decomposed vegetable matter, throwing it all into industrial grinders, masking the foul taste and smell with heavy spices and chemicals.
And selling it to an unsuspecting urban population that had no alternative sources for sustenance.
Exactly. They were a captive market.
So, society has this playbook. Scientific American is publishing these exact definitions in 1882. Why the massive 24-year gap?
That's the big question.
If everyone knows the ketchup is embalmed and the milk is watered down with chalk, why did it take a quarter of a century to actually pass a federal law?
Well, the delay comes down to the immense difficulty of translating conceptual knowledge into political will.
Especially when faced with entrenched, massively wealthy industrial interests.
Precisely. The food and drug producers of the Gilded Age were incredibly powerful. They had immense lobbying power in Washington, and they fought any form of regulation aggressively.
Well, we framed regulation as an attack on free enterprise, right?
Oh, absolutely. It wasn't until the situation escalated from a widely recognized problem into a visceral, undeniable public health crisis that the political tide began to turn.
And that transition from a known problem to an undeniable public crisis really accelerates when we look beyond the kitchen and into the medicine cabinet.
Oh, the medicine cabinet was a whole other nightmare.
Because as terrifying as the embalmed food supply was, the state of medicine in the late 19th century was operating on a whole different level of danger.
The quality of medicine during this era is described in the sources as appalling, which is almost certainly an understatement.
A massive understatement.
The medical field itself was still professionalizing, and the regulatory framework for pharmaceuticals was entirely non-existent.
We're talking about an era where anyone could mix liquids in a bathtub, slap a fancy label on a glass bottle, and call it a miracle cure.
Literally anyone.
This brings us to a really crucial part of the story. The muckrakers.
Right.
Because if the government was paralyzed by industry lobbyists, who was going to warn the public about what was actually in these little glass bottles?
The muckrakers were essentially the pioneers of investigative journalism.
Their explicit goal was to dig into the muck.
Right. Yes, the filth, the corruption, the hidden abuses of industrialized society, and expose it to the light of day.
And they found a massive, highly lucrative target in what was known as the patent medicine industry.
The patent medicine boom.
When I hear patent medicine, I instantly picture the classic snake oil salesman, standing on the back of a wooden wagon, shouting about a magic elixir that cures everything from baldness to liver disease.
That image is historically accurate for the early days, but by the late 1800s, this industry had evolved into a sophisticated, multi-million-dollar corporate enterprise.
So they weren't just guys on wagons anymore.
Not at all. These concoctions were prominently displayed in every pharmacy. They were advertised in every major newspaper across the country and wildly popular among all classes of society.
But the fundamental issue was that they were quack medicine.
Completely. They offered absolutely zero curative or therapeutic effects for the severe diseases they claimed to treat, like tuberculosis, cancer, or cholera.
But they definitely made the consumer feel a profound physical change.
No, yes.
Because while that syrup wasn't curing your tuberculosis, it was packed to the brim with incredibly potent, highly addictive narcotics.
The ingredient lists of these popular medicines read like an inventory of heavily controlled substances today.
Entirely legal, completely unregulated drugs were the chief active ingredients.
We are talking about massive quantities of alcohol, morphine, opium, cannabis, cocaine, and heroin.
It is wild to think about a world where you could casually walk into a corner store and buy a bottle of heroin because you had a persistent cough.
And the most insidious part is that the consumer usually had no idea they were purchasing heroin.
Wait, really?
There was absolutely no legal requirement for the manufacturer to list the ingredients on the label. A bottle might just be called Dr. Smith's Magical Lung Tonic.
That lack of labeling leads to the most shocking and heartbreaking detail in this entire narrative.
The infants.
The specific targeting of infants. Think about the sheer desperation of a new parent with an incredibly fussy, crying baby who refuses to sleep. You go to the pharmacy, you buy a beautifully packaged bottle of soothing syrup, specifically marketed for infants, You give it to your baby, and miraculously, the baby goes limp and sleeps for 12 hours.
You think you've found a miracle cure.
But in reality, you just dosed your infant with a heavy opium derivative.
It is a profound tragedy of the era. You had an entire generation of Americans, spanning from infants to the elderly, who were being systematically addicted to hard narcotics without their knowledge or consent.
And this was happening simply because corporations realized that creating a physical chemical dependency in their customer base guaranteed repeat business.
Exactly, and the law allowed them to do it in complete secrecy.
So we have a literal public health disaster unfolding in plain sight. Millions of people are unwittingly becoming addicted to patent medicines. Babies are being drugged with opium.
Yeah.
Why wasn't this the front page headline of every single local newspaper every single day? With a scandal this massive, the press should have been screaming about it.
The silence of the press brings us to one of the most brilliant and deeply cynical mechanisms of corporate control in American history.
I couldn't believe this when I read the sources.
It involves the findings of a journalist named Samuel Hopkins Adams, who is highlighted as a key muckraker who specifically targeted the patent medicine fraud.
Because if millions of people are getting addicted, it's baffling that local newspapers weren't running exposés. The only logical explanation is that the press was somehow financially complicit.
Oh, they were.
What did Adams actually discover about the relationship between the medicine makers and the newspapers?
Adams uncovered a literal financial gag order that kept the press entirely silent. It was known in the industry as the red clauses.
The red clauses. Let's really break down the mechanics of this because it is diabolical.
It really is.
So a red clause is essentially like a modern tech giant telling a news website today, if you publish an editorial supporting data privacy laws, we will permanently ban you from our ad network and you will go bankrupt.
That is an incredibly accurate analogy.
It's an existential threat to the publisher disguised as a standard business contract.
During this period, the newspaper industry was heavily dependent on advertising revenue, and the patent medicine companies were among the largest and wealthiest advertisers in the entire nation.
Right.
They would sign massive, long-term contracts with local and national newspapers to run their full-page ads. But these contracts weren't just about buying space.
They were buying editorial control.
Precisely. Embedded within these advertising contracts was a specific legally binding stipulation frequently printed in bright red ink, which is how it got the name red clauses.
Oh, so they literally printed it in red.
Yeah, and this clause explicitly stated that if the newspaper published any article exposing the dangers of patent medicines,
Or even if the paper's editorial board expressed any support whatsoever for food and drug regulatory legislation pending in the government.
the patent medicine company would immediately void the contract and withdraw all of their advertising money.
That is breathtakingly corrupt. It wasn't just, we will pull our ads if you write a bad review of our specific cough syrup.
No, it was much broader.
It was a blanket threat.
Real.
We will bankrupt your entire newspaper if you support any federal laws that might regulate our industry as a whole.
It was institutionalized censorship driven entirely by corporate dollars, and it resulted in a perfectly executed media blackout.
Think about the position of a local newspaper editor in 1895.
Right, they're trapped.
If they decide to act ethically and publish a story exposing the opium in the local baby syrup, they instantly lose the ad revenue that pays their reporters, keeps their printing presses running, and keeps the lights on.
They would be destroying their own livelihood, so they stayed silent.
It really puts the heroism of these muckraking journalists into perspective.
Absolutely.
They weren't just fighting the wealthy pharmaceutical companies, they were fighting the fundamental economic structure of their own journalistic industry.
They had to find independent national magazines that weren't beholden to those specific local ad contracts just to get the word out.
So here's the ultimate question. If the vast majority of newspapers were completely bought off and silenced by these red clauses, how did the truth actually break through to the general public?
How do you shatter a media blackout of that magnitude?
Yeah, how do you do it?
You shatter it by creating a spectacle so undeniably dramatic, so highly public, and so scientifically grounded that it simply cannot be ignored or covered up by contract clauses.
Okay, I see where this is going.
While journalists like Samuel Hopkins Adams were fighting the economic censorship regarding the drug industry, the science regarding the food supply was about to be tested in a way that would force its way onto the front pages.
And this introduces one of the most fascinating and unorthodox figures in this entire narrative. we have to talk about the rogue government chemist.
We are talking about Dr. Harvey Washington Wiley.
Yes, Dr. Wiley,
Eh?
the chief chemist of the Bureau of Chemistry, which at the time was a division within the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
Wiley is a pivotal historical figure because he understood a fundamental truth about human psychology and politics.
He recognized that publishing dry, academic, scientific reports about the chemical composition of adulterated food wasn't going to move the needle.
Exactly. The public wouldn't read them, and the politicians would just ignore them.
He needed a spectacle.
He needed a visceral demonstration that would capture the nation's attention and force the issue of food safety into the public consciousness, completely overriding the red clauses.
And he absolutely delivered on the spectacle. In 1902, Wiley managed to secure a modest congressional appropriation to run a series of experiments.
Right, and they were officially and very politely called hygienic table studies.
The official title sounds like a very routine, boring nutritional observation.
It does, but the reality of what Wiley did with that government funding was anything but routine.
I honestly think of this as the original and unquestionably the most dangerous reality TV show in history.
That's a great comparison.
And it was basically Fear Factor, but conducted in the name of government science decades before television existed. Walk us through the day-to-day mechanics of this trial. What exactly was Dr. Wiley doing to these people?
Well, Wiley recruited a group of young, healthy, able-bodied men, many of them government employees or volunteers, for a highly regimented dietary experiment.
Okay.
The parameters were incredibly strict. These men had to eat all of their meals at a common dining table located in the basement of the Department of Agriculture.
In the basement.
Directly supervised by Wiley and his team, they were strictly forbidden from consuming any outside food or drink.
So he created a perfectly controlled scientific environment. He controls exactly what goes into their bodies.
A completely closed system. And the food they were served was famously high quality. Yeah, they had a master chef preparing delicious, complex meal. It was some of the best food you could get in Washington, D.C. at the time.
But there was a massive catch.
A very big catch.
Alongside the pristine roasted meats and fresh vegetables, Wiley was intentionally, methodically dosing these young men with increasing amounts of the exact chemical preservatives that American food manufacturers were secretly putting into the national food supply.
He is literally feeding them poison on purpose to see how their bodies react.
It's just wild.
He was conducting human tolerance tests for industrial chemicals. He wanted irrefutable proof of what these substances did to the human body over time.
What were the specific chemicals he used?
The list is staggering. Borax, benzoate, formaldehyde, sulfates, and salicylates.
Borax. Today we use borax as a heavy-duty laundry detergent and pest control powder.
And he's feeding it to them.
And again, formaldehyde.
Yeah, borax was a very common, very cheap meat preservative at the time.
How did he even get them to eat it?
Wiley would administer these chemicals in various ways. Sometimes he would mix them directly into the milk or the meat.
Sneaking it in.
But other times, as the doses got higher and the taste became unbearable, he would put the chemicals into gelatin capsules that the men had to swallow mid-meal.
Wow. And then the observation phase began.
Right. Wiley meticulously tracked every single biological metric. He recorded their weight, their body temperature, their heart rates.
And he required them to collect and submit all of their bodily excretions, right?
Yes, urine and feces. So his team could analyze how the chemicals were being processed, or failing to be processed, by the digestive tract.
You cannot ask for a more sensational story. Even with the red clauses trying to protect the industry, a story about a government scientist secretly poisoning young men in a basement dining room is just too wild to suppress.
The media went absolutely crazy for it.
I bet.
The red clauses were generally designed to protect patent medicines, but this was a government food trial, and the drama of it made it front-page news across the country.
The newspapers started covering the hygienic table trials relentlessly, with daily updates on the men's health.
And the press gave this group of volunteers a moniker that instantly cemented them in history.
They dubbed them the Poison Squad.
Oh, Poison Squad.
Sounds like a pulp comic book team.
What's incredible is that the young men in the trial leaned into the notoriety. They became minor celebrities.
Oh, they loved it.
They even adopted a darkly humorous motto for their dining club.
Oh, was it?
Only the brave dare eat the fare.
Only the brave dare eat the fare. That is such a profound statement of purpose.
It really is.
They weren't just passive guinea pigs. They knew exactly what they were risking. They were offering their own physical health, enduring nausea headaches, and severe stomach pain to prove definitively that the American food supply was toxic.
Exactly.
So after all this dramatic testing, what did the data actually show? Did Wiley get the smoking gun he needed?
From a purely modern, rigorous scientific standpoint, the results were somewhat complex.
Because there were so many variables.
Right, because they were studying a complex human diet with multiple variables over long periods, some of the specific conclusions about certain chemicals were later debated by other scientists.
Okay, fair enough.
However, on the most crucial immediate front, the trial was an absolute triumph.
What was the undeniable finding?
The devastating effects of formaldehyde.
The embalming fluid.
Yes, there was zero scientific ambiguity, even among industry defenders, that formaldehyde was acutely dangerous to human health.
The men in the poison squad got violently, undeniably ill when dosed with it.
Their bodies simply could not process it, and because the newspapers were reporting on these severe symptoms daily, the public was reading about it over breakfast.
The massive publicity surrounding the trials made formaldehyde toxic, not just biologically, but economically.
It disappeared very quickly as a food preservative because consumers knew to fear it.
It is a dark commentary on the era that it took human guinea pigs getting violently sick on the front page of the Washington Post to make corporate producers stop embalming the nation's ketchup.
It really is. And this brings us to a secondary but equally important realization that Wiley forced into the public eye.
Which was?
He emphasized that in many cases, particularly with heavily processed foods like ketchup, sauces, and canned meats, these dangerous preservatives weren't actually being used to keep fresh food fresh.
Right.
They were being used to actively disguise deeply unsanitary, horrifying production practices.
If you are making ketchup in a pristine sanitary kitchen with fresh tomatoes, you can seal it properly and it will last.
Exactly.
But if your factory is filthy and you're using tomatoes that are already rotting on the floor, you need a powerful chemical solvent to mask the smell, the sour taste, and the visual decay.
The chemical preservative is just a toxic Band-Aid placed over a much grosser systemic hygiene problem.
And this is where we see the true lasting impact of the Poison Squad. It wasn't just about compiling scientific data for Congress. It was a masterclass in massive public education.
Wiley formally concluded that he found adverse health effects from large doses of all the preservatives tested. But more importantly, the American public believed him.
They saw these healthy young men, the picture of American vitality, getting sick from the exact same chemicals that were in their pantries. And they had a collective realization. Wait, that's what I've been feeding my children.
That realization led to a fascinating and immediate shift in consumer behavior.
Even before Congress managed to pass a single federal law banning these substances, consumers took matters into their own hands.
They increasingly turned away from any brands or products known or suspected to contain these chemical preservatives.
The public education campaign worked perfectly. People started voting with their wallets, and the food industry felt the economic pressure instantly.
That is a massive testament to the power of transparent information.
Wiley cracked the facade. He showed the public the literal poison on their plates.
He did.
But to actually force the federal government to take the unprecedented, historically radical step of regulating private industry, they needed more than just a gradual shift in consumer spending habits.
Right. They needed a shock to the system.
They needed an emotional, visceral, revolting reaction that would make the status quo completely untenable for the politicians sitting in Washington.
And that visceral shock arrived in 1906.
But it didn't come in the form of a peer-reviewed scientific report from the Bureau of Chemistry, did it?
No, it came in the pages of a fiction novel.
We are talking, of course, about The Jungle.
Yes. Written by Upton Sinclair, a muckraking journalist, and published in the exact same year the Pure Food Act was ultimately passed.
This book is legendary in American history. We've talked about the science and the journalism, but explain how The Jungle acted as the final explosive catalyst.
Well, Upton Sinclair took a different approach than Adams or Wiley. He wanted to reach a massive working-class audience, so he chose to present his investigative findings in the format of a gripping narrative novel.
The Jungle tells the story of a family of Lithuanian immigrants trying to survive while working in the brutal meatpacking district of Chicago.
Right. But while the characters are fiction, the setting was terrifyingly real.
Because he actually went there.
Sinclair spent 7 weeks undercover, dressed in work clothes, walking the floors of the packing plants, observing every detail. So the horrors he described were based on his actual first-hand observations.
The descriptions in this book are infamous. We are talking about graphic, revolting, incredibly detailed depictions of unsanitary conditions and completely unscrupulous practices that were rampant in the meatpacking industry.
He forced the American public to confront exactly what the clinical term unsanitary conditions actually meant in practice.
He didn't just write about abstract bacteria counts.
No, he wrote graphic depictions of diseased cattle being processed without inspection. He wrote about dark, unventilated rooms swarming with rats.
And the rat poison.
Yes. How the workers will put poisoned bread out for the rats, and then the dead rats, the poisoned bread, and the meat would all get swept up together and shoveled into the giant meat grinders.
It is so disgusting. And the injuries, too.
He wrote about workers who lost fingers in the machinery and how that blood and bone just became part of the daily quota.
It is one thing to read a dry scientific paper saying there are sulfites and high bacteria counts in the sausage. That engages your intellect.
Sure.
It is an entirely different, deeply psychological experience to read a vivid sensory description of a poisoned rat falling into a grinder and realizing that is the exact brand of sausage you ate for breakfast that morning.
It completely shattered the illusion of the modern, hygienic, miraculous industrial food system.
People literally stopped eating meat, didn't they?
They did. The revulsion was so intense it caused a massive dip in meat sales. It kept the public's attention laser-focused on the extreme, unhygienic conditions in meat processing plants.
The outrage wasn't just a political debate anymore. It was immediate, explosive, and deeply personal.
But here is the ironic, almost tragicomic twist to the entire story of the jungle.
Right. Sinclair didn't write the book to be a food safety manifesto, did he?
No, he did not. And this is a brilliant example of how a piece of journalism can spark a revolution entirely different from the one the author intended.
Because Sinclair was a staunch, passionate socialist.
His primary driving goal in writing The Jungle was to expose the brutal, inhumane labor conditions, the wage slavery, and the physical exploitation of the immigrant workers in these plants.
He wanted the public to read the book and immediately demand a movement for labor rights, unionization, and better working conditions.
He wanted them to care about the workers making the sausage.
But the public totally missed that message.
Completely ignored it. They largely ignored the plight of the workers. Instead, they panicked in pure self-interest about what they were personally putting into their own mouths.
Sinclair realized this massive disconnect, and he summarized it in a famous, deeply cynical quote regarding the reception of his book.
Which is, I aimed at the public's heart, and by accident, I hit it in the stomach.
I aimed at the public's heart, and by accident, I hit it in the stomach. It's such a perfect summation of human nature.
It really is.
He wanted empathy for the laborer, and he got sheer panic over the sausage.
But regardless of his intentions, the result of that panic was a political earthquake in Washington.
It was the definitive tipping point. So you have to look at the timeline we've constructed. You had this perfect storm of pressure building for 27 years.
Right.
You had the slow realization of the adulteration problem since that 1882 Scientific American article.
Then you had Samuel Hopkins Adams finally exposing the patent medicine fraud and the insidious nature of the red clauses.
You had Dr. Wiley's Poison Squad, proving the biological danger of preservatives on the front pages.
You had social activists like Florence Kelley organizing women and demanding change at the grassroots level.
And then the jungle drops into that highly combustible environment like a bomb, and it all coalesces into an undeniable, deafening public outcry.
An outraged, disgusted public literally demanded that the federal government take action.
The politicians could no longer ignore the issue. They could no longer hide behind corporate lobbyists, and they could no longer pretend the free market was going to fix itself.
The pressure reached the absolute highest office in the land, President Theodore Roosevelt.
Roosevelt, who initially was highly skeptical of Sinclair.
Very skeptical. He thought Sinclair was just a socialist agitator, but he decided he had to verify the claims.
So what did he do?
Roosevelt sent his own independent investigators to Chicago to inspect the meatpacking plants.
And what did they find?
When those investigators returned and confirmed that the horrors in the book were entirely accurate, Roosevelt realized he had to act immediately.
The political momentum was unstoppable.
And so, on June 30th, 1906, Roosevelt signed two monumental pieces of progressive-era legislation into law on the exact same day.
The Federal Meat Inspection Act, which addressed the slaughterhouses directly, and the main subject of our deep dive today, the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906.
Also commonly known as the Wiley Act, or Dr. Wiley's Law, in honor of the chief chemist whose relentless advocacy and dramatic science helped force the issue.
Okay, so after nearly 3 decades of ignored warnings, after the embalmed ketchup, after the opium-laced soothing syrups killing infants, after the poison squad vomiting in the basement of the USDA, and the graphic, rat-infested horrors of the jungle.
The public finally forces the government's hand. The law is signed.
But what did this landmark piece of legislation actually do? Did it just wave a magic wand, ban all the bad stuff, and make the grocery store safe overnight?
Not exactly.
Let's get into the mechanical nuts and bolts of the Wiley Act.
The 1906 Act is fundamentally important because it was a foundational law. It represented the very first time the federal government stepped in to regulate the quality of foods and drugs on a national scale.
Right.
Its core purpose, legally speaking, was to ban foreign and interstate traffic in adulterated or mislabeled food and drug products.
Interstate traffic, that is a really important legal distinction to pause on, right?
Yes, very important.
Because of the way the U.S. Constitution is structured, the federal government didn't have the blanket authority to just dictate what a guy making sausages in his basement in New York sold to his neighbor down the street in New York.
That is correct. The constitutional reach of this 1906 Act was strictly limited by the Commerce Clause to foods and drugs moving in interstate commerce.
Meaning products crossing state lines.
Exactly. While the drafters drew heavily on legal experiments pioneered by individual states, this was the moment the federal government established clear, national, legally binding definitions for the concepts of misbranding and adulteration.
And more importantly, prescribed federal penalties for violating those definitions.
Right. So it established a national baseline that companies had to meet if they wanted to do business across the country.
What were the specific rules regarding drugs? Because we spent a lot of time talking about how chaotic and deadly the patent medicine industry was.
For drugs, the law introduced a massive shift toward transparency. It required that active ingredients be explicitly and clearly placed on the label of the packaging. Furthermore, it mandated that drugs could not fall below specific purity levels. And they didn't just invent those levels. The law tethered the standards to recognized authoritative medical texts.
Like which ones?
Specifically the United States Pharmacopoeia or the National Formulary.
Okay, so if you are selling a drug, it has to be as pure as the official medical textbooks say it should be, and you have to list what is actually in the bottle.
Exactly.
Now, here's the detail that absolutely fascinates me, and I think it will deeply surprise a lot of listeners. The 1906 law didn't actually ban the dangerous drugs we talked about earlier, did it?
No, it absolutely did not.
Wait, really?
And understanding this is critical to understanding the philosophy of the progressive era. The 1906 Act was not a prohibition law. It was principally designed as a truth in labeling law.
A truth in labeling law, meaning you could still legally manufacture and sell the heroin cough syrup.
Yes. Under the strict letter of the law, if your product contained any of the 10 specific ingredients that the government deemed addictive and/or dangerous, a list that explicitly included alcohol, morphine, opium, and cannabis, you simply had to state that fact accurately and visibly on the label.
You just had to accurately label the contents and the dosage.
That's it.
So prior to 1906, you bought a mystery bottle of Dr. Smith's soothing syrup that secretly contained heavy opium, and you accidentally addicted your child.
Right.
After 1906, you could still buy that exact same bottle, but it now proudly and clearly stated contains opium right on the front.
Exactly. Cocaine, heroin, cannabis. These continued to be legally available over the counter without a doctor's prescription as long as the manufacturer was honest about the ingredients.
That is just, it's a completely different approach than the strict prohibition and scheduling models that the government would adopt in later decades.
The underlying philosophy of this specific progressive era legislation wasn't necessarily paternalistic. It wasn't the government trying to tell adult consumers what they could or could not put into their own bodies.
The philosophy was to ensure that consumers were capable of making informed choices.
The goal was to raise manufacturing standards, protect citizens from outright fraud, and this is a very important economic driver of the law to protect the reputations and pocketbooks of honest businessmen.
Right. Because they were constantly being undercut by fraudulent competitors selling cheap, adulterated garbage.
Exactly.
It was entirely about transparency. The government said, we won't stop you from buying the opium, but we will make absolutely sure you know exactly what you're buying.
Right. But a law is only as good as the enforcement behind it.
Right. A law on a piece of paper doesn't stop a factory owner from lying. Who was actually out there making sure these labels were accurate?
Enforcement of the Pure Food and Drug Act was assigned to the man who helped make it happen. Dr. Wiley and his domain, the Bureau of Chemistry within the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
The law officially established a federal cadre of food and drug inspectors.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Whose explicit job was to travel the country, examine products in factories and on trains, identify misbranded or adulterated goods, and refer those offenders to federal prosecutors.
I have to bring up a specific quote about these inspectors because the pushback from the industry and anti-federalists was incredibly intense. They hated these guys.
Oh, they despise them.
One Southern opponent of the legislation criticized this new federal inspection force as a Trojan horse with a belly full of inspectors and other employees.
That quote perfectly encapsulates the deep-seated political anxiety of the era regarding federal overreach.
People, particularly in certain regions, were simply not used to federal agents walking into local, privately owned factories and demanding to test what was in the mixing vats.
It was viewed by opponents as a massive expansion of federal power invading local commerce.
So these Trojan horse inspectors find a violation. Let's say they find a company selling watered-down milk with chalk, or a medicine that claims to cure cancer but is just alcohol and food coloring.
Okay.
What were the actual penalties? Did they drag the factory owners out in handcuffs and throw them in federal prison?
No, criminal jail time was rare.
Oh.
The immediate monetary penalties outlined under the law were actually quite modest by today's standards.
So a small fine wasn't necessarily going to deter a massive multi-million-dollar corporation that was making a fortune off of adulterated goods.
Exactly. They would just factor the fine into their budget as a minor cost of doing business.
Right. A slap on the wrist, a speeding ticket for a millionaire.
However, the drafters of the law understood economics, and they included an underappreciated provision in the act that proved far more powerful than the monetary fines.
What was it?
It was a two-pronged enforcement approach that gave the law genuine, terrifying teeth. First, goods that were found to be in violation of the law were subject to immediate seizure and physical destruction.
Right.
And the cost of that destruction was billed directly to the manufacturer.
Oh, that is a brilliant logistical weapon.
It really is.
You don't just fine them a few $100s. You physically confiscate an entire train car full of their inventory. You burn it, and you make them pay the invoice for the matches.
That hits the bottom line in a way they can't ignore.
It completely disrupts their supply chain, destroys their inventory, and ruins their profit margins for that quarter.
But the second prong of the enforcement strategy was perhaps even more effective psychologically and economically in the long run.
What was the second prong?
There was a strict legal requirement that all convictions under the Act must be officially published by the government as notices of judgment.
Notices of judgment.
Yeah.
So essentially a system of government-mandated public shaming.
Very official, very public shaming.
How did that work?
If your company was caught adulterating food or lying on a label, the federal government would publish a notice detailing exactly what you did, the name of the product, and the name of the company.
In an era where national brand reputation was becoming increasingly vital for corporate success, this had a massive, chilling deterrent effect upon would-be violators.
You absolutely did not want your brand's name printed in a widely circulated federal notice identifying you as a purveyor of rotten, formaldehyde-laced food.
That is fascinating. The law used market economics, supply chain disruption, and public relations as its primary weapons, rather than relying solely on criminal jail time.
Right.
So the Wiley Act is passed in 1906. The inspectors are out in the field seizing goods, burning inventory, and publishing notices of judgment. Let's talk about the immediate legacy of this act. Did it actually work?
The immediate impact was quite profound, particularly in the realm of those dangerous patent medicines.
Give me some numbers. How much did it drop?
The statistics from the era provide a staggering metric of success. It is estimated that the sale of patent medicines containing opiates decreased by a massive 33% almost immediately after the labeling requirement was mandated.
33%. That is a full third of a massive, incredibly lucrative market just evaporating into thin air.
And again, we have to remember, the law didn't ban the opiates. People could still legally buy them.
That 33% drop happened simply because people could finally read the label and know what was inside the bottle.
Exactly. Once parents realized the soothing syrup they had been giving their crying infant secretly contained morphine or opium, a third of them immediately stopped buying it out of sheer horror.
The truth in labeling approach proved highly effective in reducing accidental addiction and unwitting usage without requiring a blanket prohibition.
It did.
That is the raw power of an informed consumer base. When you remove the deception and give people the truth, they will generally make safer, more rational choices for themselves and their families.
And the law also sparked some truly wild, unprecedented legal battles as the federal government began to flex its new regulatory muscles against massive corporations.
Like which ones?
One of the most famous early cases demonstrating this new dynamic happened in 1909, and it involved an iconic, globally recognized American brand, Coca-Cola.
Yes, the Coca-Cola trial. Okay, set the scene for this, because this is the piece of corporate history most people probably don't know.
To understand the stakes of the 1909 trial, we have to look back slightly to the year 1903.
Okay.
Prior to 1903, the active, stimulating ingredient in Coca-Cola was exactly what the name implies. Cocaine derived from the coca leaf.
Coca for the cocaine, coal for the caffeine-rich cola nut. It was literal, exact truth in advertising back then.
It was. But by 1903, public sentiment and medical understanding were already turning sharply against the use of cocaine.
Recognizing this shift, the Coca-Cola company voluntarily removed the cocaine from their recipe, right?
Yes, and they replaced it with a massive, highly concentrated amount of caffeine to maintain that signature stimulating kick that their customers expected.
Okay, so the cocaine is completely gone from the recipe 3 years before the 1906 Act even passes. Why is the federal government aggressively going after them in 1909?
Because under the new powers granted by the 1906 law, the government was empowered to challenge products they deemed adulterated or misbranded in any way that posed a threat to public health.
Oh, I see.
The government decided to target the new recipe. They argued that Coca-Cola's excessive caffeine content was inherently dangerous and constituted an adulteration.
They actually tried to outlaw the soda entirely based on the caffeine levels.
Yes. The resulting legal case has an amazing, incredibly specific name. United States v. 40 barrels and 20 kegs of Coca-Cola.
United States v. 40 barrels and 20 kegs of Coca-Cola. They literally sued the physical barrels of syrup. I love historical legal nomenclature.
It was what is known in the legal field as an in rem jurisdiction case, meaning the legal action is taken directly against the property itself rather than against a person or corporation.
So the government seized the barrels and put them on trial.
Exactly. The initial ruling in the lower courts was actually a significant victory for the company.
All right.
The judge found that because caffeine was an inherent part of the formula, Coca-Cola had a right to use it as they saw fit, and it wasn't an added adulterant.
So Coca-Cola wins round one to keep their highly caffeinated recipe.
But the government, driven by the new mandate of the Wiley Act, refused to give up. They appealed the lower court's decision, and they pushed the case all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States.
And what happened?
Ultimately, the government prevailed. Coca-Cola lost at the Supreme Court level.
Wow. So the Supreme Court of the United States ruled against the recipe of the most popular soda in the country.
The ruling forced Coca-Cola to the negotiating table. It led to a settlement where Coca-Cola legally agreed with the United States government to significantly reduce the amount of caffeine in their formula.
That is just, it's a perfect, striking illustration of how drastically the 1906 Act shifted the balance of power in America.
It really is.
Before 1906, a company could put whatever chemical concoction they wanted into their product, and the government had no say.
Right.
Just 3 years after the law passed, the federal government possessed the authority to force a massively popular, incredibly wealthy corporation to alter its fundamental, secret recipe in the name of public health.
That is a colossal structural shift in the relationship between the government, private industry, and the everyday consumer.
And the agency that was pioneering all this enforcement, Dr. Wiley's Bureau of Chemistry. It didn't stay the Bureau of Chemistry forever, did it? It evolved into something much bigger.
It evolved significantly, and this is a key part of the 1906 Act's enduring legacy.
Oh, so?
The 1906 Act is generally considered the founding legislative moment of the modern Food and Drug Administration, the FDA.
Though it is important to clarify that the agency itself existed as the Bureau of Chemistry before the law was passed, and it wasn't actually named the FDA until much later in its history.
Right. It started as Dr. Wiley's laboratory.
Trace that bureaucratic evolution for us. How do we get from a basement full of chemists poisoning volunteers to the massive FDA apparatus we know today?
Well, the Bureau of Chemistry was tasked with regulating food and drug safety under the framework of the 1906 Act. But by 1927, the scope of their regulatory work had grown so massive and complex that the Bureau was fundamentally reorganized. The regulatory and enforcement functions were separated from the purely agricultural research functions into a brand new entity called the Food, Drug, and Insecticide Administration.
The Food, Drug, and Insecticide Administration. That is a deeply uncatchy, very bureaucratic name.
It is a mouthful. Thankfully, just 3 years later, in 1930, they decided to shorten it.
So what?
The FDIA dropped the insecticide and was officially renamed the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA we know today.
The modern FDA is born, but the 1906 Wiley Act itself, the actual law on the books, didn't survive forever, right? The framework had limits.
It did. As foundational and revolutionary as the 1906 Act was, it was essentially a first draft of federal regulation.
Right.
It was passed in a very specific era, and deficiencies in the statute became increasingly noticeable and problematic by the 1920s.
What were the main loopholes they realized they needed to close?
For one, the 1906 law made no provision for federal food standards, only drug standards based on those medical texts.
Oh, I see.
It couldn't mandate exactly what constituted a standard loaf of bread or bottle of ketchup. It was also still strictly limited to interstate commerce, leaving a lot of local loopholes.
And I imagine technology played a part too.
Most importantly, the technology of mass food and drug production was advancing incredibly rapidly, creating entirely new classes of synthetic dangers that the old 1906 law simply lacked the vocabulary or authority to address.
So the industry innovated past the regulations, and the government needed a massive upgrade to catch up.
Exactly. That vital upgrade arrived in 1938 with the passage of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act.
This was a vastly more comprehensive, modern piece of legislation.
It was signed into law by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, which is an interesting historical bookend, not to be confused with Theodore Roosevelt, who signed the original 1906 law.
That's a fun fact.
The 1938 Act overhauled the system, and it, along with its numerous amendments over the subsequent decades, remains the core statutory basis for the federal regulation of everything from biological products and cosmetics to medical devices and radiation-emitting technology today.
It's incredible to trace that direct lineage. Every single time you go to the grocery store today and you turn a box of cereal around to read the nutrition facts label, or every time you look at the exact milligrams of active ingredients on a bottle of aspirin,
You are interacting directly with the legacy of the 1906 Act.
you are looking at the hard-won victories of Dr. Wiley's terrifying science experiments, Upton Sinclair's undercover reporting, Samuel Hopkins Adams fighting the red clauses, and the sheer unyielding outrage of the American public who refused to be poisoned anymore.
And the legacy of the 1906 Act isn't just a dusty piece of historical trivia. Its underlying philosophy actively informs very serious modern debates.
Really, in what specific context are people bringing up a 1906 law today?
Well, the philosophy of the 1906 law, that laser focus on accurate labeling and transparency rather than outright paternalistic prohibition, is still heavily cited today in contemporary discussions about drug policy.
It is brought up specifically among modern drug policy reform advocates, right?
Yes. For example, advocates like Jim Gray point directly to the 1906 Act as a highly successful, proven historical model for how society might approach the relegalization of currently prohibited drugs.
Their core argument is that instead of spending billions on a punitive war on drugs that drives the market underground, we should return to the 1906 system.
They argue for requiring completely accurate labels, rigorously monitoring the purity and dose of the substances, and relying on massive, honest consumer education.
And they point to that astonishing 33% drop in opiate sales in the early 1900s as proof that when you give consumers the truth, the market regulates itself far better than prohibition does.
Exactly.
That is a fascinating connection, using a Gilded Age consumer protection law as a literal blueprint for 21st century drug reform.
It raises a fundamental, enduring question about governance. It's a question that is just as relevant today as it was when Dr. Wiley was fighting the meatpackers.
Which is, what is the optimal balance of responsibility?
Exactly. How much should the government intervene to forcefully ban dangerous substances entirely to protect us from ourselves, and how much should the government simply mandate total transparency, ensure the label is accurate, and then trust the informed consumer to make their own choices?
The 1906 Act leaned heavily toward transparency and consumer choice. Modern laws have swung much further toward bans and strict federal approvals.
It's a philosophical pendulum between freedom and safety that continues to swing.
It is a pendulum, and it's a debate we are constantly having in different forms across different industries.
We really are.
Well, we have covered an incredible amount of ground today. We started in a true nightmare scenario of formaldehyde-laced ketchup and opium-dosed infants.
We explored how the shift from farms to cities broke the supply chain and created an economic incentive for widespread, deadly adulteration.
We saw how muckraking journalists like Samuel Hopkins Adams fought against the corporate censorship of the Red Clauses to expose the massive patent medicine frauds.
We followed Dr. Wiley and his poison squad as they used dramatic, highly publicized human trials to prove the biological dangers of chemical preservatives to the public.
We witnessed how Upton Sinclair aimed at the public's heart with the jungle, but accidentally hit them in the stomach,
Sparking the ultimate, undeniable public outcry that forced President Theodore Roosevelt and a reluctant Congress to finally act.
And we unpacked the deep legacy of the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, a truth and labeling law that changed American consumerism forever, birthed the modern FDA, and continues to influence policy debates today.
It is a stunning, ultimately hopeful story of how journalism, science, and public demand can actually conquer entrenched corporate corruption.
It is a powerful reminder that the safety we enjoy today is not an accident. It is the result of relentless, organized historical effort.
It really is.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over as you go about your week.
We spent this entire time talking about the physical poisons of the past.
Right. The 1906 law was designed to combat hidden physical poisons in our food and drugs, and the journalists combated the financial red clauses that kept the newspapers quiet about those dangers.
Today, we demand completely accurate labels for what we put into our bodies. We want to know every single ingredient, every calorie, every preservative.
But if we look at our lives today, the landscape of consumption has shifted. We spend hours every single day consuming digital media, fed to us by complex, completely invisible algorithms designed by massive corporations to keep our attention.
Sometimes at the expense of our mental well-being or our grasp on objective truth.
Exactly. So ask yourself,
Yeah.
what are the modern red clauses hidden in the algorithms and the digital media we consume every day?
We fought a massive historical war to get accurate labels for the physical food we put into our bodies.
But what would it take to demand a label for the hidden ingredients we are feeding our minds? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time.